Riverton, Oregon, was the kind of place most people forgot about as soon as they drove through. Tucked between rolling pine-covered hills and the wide Columbia River, it had a population small enough that people still recognized each other at the grocery store, and quiet enough that you could leave your front door unlocked without thinking twice. That's why, on the evening of November 2nd, 1998, when the first whispers began about a double homicide just blocks from Riverton Pacific University, nobody believed it. Not here, they said. Not in Riverton. But the truth was already written in the bloodstains drying on a kitchen floor at the edge of town. Karen Whitfield had lived in Riverton for only 3 years, but she wasn't a stranger to hardship. At 43, she had already survived the kind of loss that changes a person forever, the death of her first son in a traffic accident when he was just 7 years old. Those who knew her said she carried that grief quietly, like a folded piece of paper kept in her pocket, always there, always close to her heart. But she didn't let it break her. She built herself back up, one day at a time, and eventually moved here for a fresh start. She worked as a maintenance technician at Riverton Pacific University, a job that was physically demanding but honest. She liked the routine, early mornings, the hum of tools, the comfort of fixing things that were broken. And she was known for being someone you could count on, steady, good-humored, and willing to help anyone who needed it. When Karen met Melissa Hartman, a bright-eyed 25-year-old with a quick laugh and a stubborn streak, something shifted in her life. Melissa had just graduated from college and was figuring out her next steps. The two women met over a small furniture repair job. Melissa needed an old cedar chest refinished, and Karen, in her spare time, did woodworking. That first conversation turned into friendship, and friendship, over months, turned into something more. By the spring of 1998, Melissa had moved in with Karen, bringing her little Pomeranian, Baxter, along. The house, 2 stories, 4 bedrooms, was rented from a university staff member and sat in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood not far from campus. For Karen, it was the closest thing to peace she'd had in years. The household grew that summer when Karen's nephew, Ethan Cole, came to stay. At 26, Ethan was athletic, quiet, and focused on his dream of becoming a professional wrestler. He'd been close to Karen since he was a kid, and she'd always looked out for him like a second mother. Ethan quickly found part-time work in the university's facilities department, thanks to Karen's connections. That fall, the 3 of them, Karen, Melissa, and Ethan, settled into an easy rhythm. Melissa and Ethan got along well, close enough in age to share jokes and late-night TV sessions in the living room. Matthew, Karen's teenage son from her previous marriage, spent most of the summer visiting from Maine before returning to his father's home. The house was lively, warm, and filled with the comfortable noise of everyday life. But even in the most peaceful towns, some stories are already taking shape quietly behind closed doors. Somewhere in another state, there was someone who believed Karen Whitfield was standing in the way of what they wanted. Someone who had loved Melissa once and couldn't let go. Patricia, Patty, Rowan was 47 and living in a small apartment in rural Montana. Outwardly, she was unremarkable, slightly heavy-set, often dressed in faded work clothes, polite to neighbors but not overly social. She'd once been close to Melissa. Very close. Years earlier, after a bad breakup and a spell of sleeping in her car, Patty had found refuge in Melissa's apartment. Their friendship had turned into romance, but the relationship was unstable, marked by arguments, reconciliations, and, eventually, a breakup initiated by Melissa. By the time Melissa moved to Riverton and started a new life with Karen, she thought Patty was just part of her past. But Patty didn't see it that way. She called often, sometimes under the guise of casual conversation, sometimes to rehash old grievances. And when Melissa stopped answering as much, Patty's frustration hardened into something darker. What Melissa didn't know was that Patty was talking about her to others, about how Melissa had moved on too quickly, about how this new woman, Karen, had ruined everything. Friends who'd been around Patty during that time would later recall offhand remarks that sounded like jokes at first, but weren't. She'd say things like, "If she thinks she can just walk away," and trail off, shaking her head. There's an old saying, in small towns, grudges grow like weeds. In Patty's mind, Karen wasn't just an ex's new partner, she was an obstacle to be removed. On the morning of November 2nd, 1998, Riverton was gray and cold, the kind of damp Pacific Northwest chill that clings to your skin. Karen and Ethan went to work as usual, both dressed in their maintenance uniforms. Melissa, working an earlier shift that day, left after crating Baxter and double-checking the locks on the windows and doors. By late afternoon, the streets were quiet. Halloween decorations still lingered, a few carved pumpkins collapsing on porches, strings of orange lights sagging between railings. The air carried that faint, sweet smell of fallen leaves starting to rot. Melissa's shift ended at 5 p.m., and she drove home, expecting to find Karen and Ethan already there. Their workday usually ended around 3:30, and by now they'd have had time to change clothes, maybe start dinner. But when she pulled into the driveway and saw Karen's car in the garage, the house dark, she hesitated. She stepped inside, calling their names. No answer. The stillness was heavy, unnatural. The first thing she noticed was Baxter's silence. No barking, no nails skittering on the floor. The second was how cold the air felt inside, as though the house itself was holding its breath. When Melissa reached the kitchen, her foot caught on something, and she stumbled forward. She flicked on the light. The scene in front of her didn't make sense at first, colors, shapes, shadows, until her eyes settled on the bodies. Karen and Ethan lay face down on the tile, still wearing their work jackets. Dark pools spread out beneath them, glistening under the overhead light. For a split second, some irrational part of her thought it was a prank, some twisted post-Halloween joke. But the torn fabric on Karen's coat, the unnatural stillness of Ethan's arm bent at the wrong angle, those details cut through her denial. Melissa screamed, the sound breaking in her throat. She dropped to her knees, shaking Karen's shoulder, begging her to wake up. She turned to Ethan, but his eyes stared past her, unfocused. That was when she saw the rest of it, the splatters on the walls, the overturned chair, the shattered ceramic on the floor. And near the doorway, a kitchen knife, its blade dark to the hilt. In that moment, Melissa's mind was both racing and frozen. She needed to call for help, but when she reached for the phone on the counter, there was only a limp cord dangling, cut clean. Melissa's hand trembled as she pulled away from the cut phone cord. For a heartbeat, she thought of running upstairs to find another phone, but the heavy stillness of the house made her skin crawl. Every instinct told her she wasn't safe. Whoever had done this, were they still here? She bolted through the front door, her footsteps crunching over the frost-dusted grass. The closest house belonged to an older couple, the Burtons, who'd lived there for decades. She pounded on their door until Mr. Burton appeared, eyes widening as he took in Melissa's pale face and shaking hands. "There, Karen and Ethan," she gasped, words breaking. "Please call 911. Within minutes, the quiet street was alive with motion. The first Riverton patrol car pulled up, its red and blue lights splashing color over the darkened houses. Officer Dan Weller stepped out, one hand on his holster, scanning the surroundings as Melissa clutched her arms around herself. Weller entered the Whitfield house cautiously, calling out as he moved toward the kitchen. What he saw stopped him cold. Two bodies, side by side, still in their work clothes, the air faintly metallic with the scent of blood. He didn't touch anything, just backed out, radioing for backup and securing the perimeter. The Burtons had brought Melissa inside their home to sit her down, pressing a mug of tea into her hands she didn't drink. Her mind was stuck on the image of Karen's torn coat, the shards of ceramic, the knife on the floor. She told herself she hadn't seen blood, at least, not clearly, but deep down she knew that wasn't true. By the time Detective Laura Hendricks arrived with the crime scene team, the block had been cordoned off. Neighbors stood in clusters behind the tape, murmuring. Riverton hadn't seen a homicide in years, and now 2 in one day? It didn't fit the place they thought they knew. Inside the kitchen, the forensics team worked methodically. The first thing they noted, the victims' jackets were zipped, suggesting they had only just walked in when they were attacked. No time to change, no time to drop their bags. Blood spatter patterns on the walls told a story, one that began near the side door leading from the garage. There were 3 distinct pools, suggesting both victims had been targeted quickly, one after the other, and that at least one had still been moving after the first blows. On the counter, the cordless phone lay with its cord cleanly severed. That alone was strange. Why cut a cordless phone line unless you plan to stop someone from calling for help? Hendricks made a mental note, premeditation. There were more details. A long-bladed kitchen knife lay near the refrigerator, its edge catching the overhead light. Another knife was found on the living room coffee table, and a third near an overturned candy bowl left from Halloween. None bore clear fingerprints. And then there was the vase, what was left of it. Scattered across the floor, shards of deep blue ceramic were mixed with glass from a broken lamp. The position of the fragments suggested they had been used as weapons, then shattered. But the most curious discovery was outside, a faint trail of blood drops leading away from the side door toward the street. The drops were uneven, as though the person was moving quickly, injured but not critically. The trail ended at the curb, where tire impressions marked the damp earth. Hendricks crouched, brushing her fingers over the tread pattern. "Someone picked them up," she murmured to the crime scene tech. "They didn't walk out of here alone." As the bodies were prepared for transport, the coroner made an initial observation. Both victims had sustained multiple types of injuries, gunshot wounds, blunt force trauma, and stabbing. That combination was unusual. Most attackers relied on a single weapon. Switching between weapons suggested either extreme rage, a chaotic struggle, or more than one attacker. Melissa, meanwhile, was brought to the station for a formal statement. Hendricks knew the protocol. The person who finds the bodies is always looked at closely. And Melissa's connection to both victims and her presence in the home meant they had to rule her out. Melissa sat in the small interview room, her hands wrapped around a bottle of water she hadn't opened. She told the story as steadily as she could, leaving for work that morning, crating Baxter, locking up, returning to find the house dark, discovering Karen and Ethan, and running for help. Hendricks asked the obvious question. "Did you notice anything out of place before you found them?" Melissa hesitated. "The phone. The cord was cut." And she stopped, swallowing hard. Baxter wasn't barking. He always barks when people come in. Where was he? In his crate. Still in the living room. He seemed scared. That detail stuck in Hendricks's mind. If the dog hadn't barked, maybe he already knew the people in the house. Back at the scene, another officer called Hendricks over. "You're gonna want to hear this." In the kitchen, beside the phone, sat an old-fashioned answering machine. The small digital display read, "Memory full." When an evidence tech pressed play, a series of saved messages began to play. Most were mundane, reminders, a wrong number, until one recording stood out. It wasn't a message at all. It was chaos. The sound of shattering glass. A woman's voice, sharp with fear, "Please, you don't have to do this." Another female voice, lower, harder, barking something about getting it over with. In the background, a man's voice, a name maybe, cut through briefly. And then more crashing, the scrape of a chair, and a second plea, "At least let him go." He didn't do anything. The recording ended abruptly. Hendricks looked at the tech. "That's from today?" "Timestamp says 3:41 p.m., he replied. "Right in their window for getting home." For the first time that night, Hendricks felt the edges of the case sharpening. This wasn't random. Whoever had done this had come with intent, and they hadn't come alone. What she didn't know yet, but would soon, was that the recording had captured more than just voices. Somewhere in those 7 minutes of chaos was a name. And that name would be the thread that began to unravel everything. The evidence tech replayed the recording, this time with the volume up and the background noise filtered as much as their portable equipment could manage. Detective Laura Hendricks leaned closer, her eyes narrowing as she listened. The voices were clearer now. The frightened woman's pleas were distinct. "Patty, stop, please, just talk to me." Hendricks glanced at the tech. "Did she say Patty?" "Pretty sure," he replied. "And listen here," he rewound 10 seconds. A male voice came through, not yelling but urgent, calling out, "Patty," as though trying to pull her back from something. Then came another crash, the clatter of a chair, and the line went dead. In a case that had, until now, been shadows and shapes, Hendricks suddenly had something solid. A name. Patty. She didn't waste time. By the next morning, she was back in the station conference room, the recording queued up for the small team assigned to the case. We have probable cause to believe one of the assailants was named Patty. We also know there was a man present. That means 2 attackers, possibly more. Officer Weller asked the question everyone was thinking. Could Patty be someone they knew? The dog didn't bark. Exactly, Hendricks said. And Melissa confirmed the dog only stays quiet around familiar people. So this wasn't a break-in by strangers. They started with the most logical source, Melissa herself. When Hendricks brought her back in for a second interview, she didn't play games. Melissa, we heard Karen call someone named Patty during the attack. Who is that? Melissa froze. For a moment, her eyes darted toward the floor. Patricia Rowan, she finally said. We used to be together. Years ago. Tell me about her. Melissa hesitated, then told the story. How she'd met Patty in Montana, how they'd lived together for a while, the fights, the eventual breakup. She insisted she hadn't spoken to Patty in months, at least, not more than a polite exchange now and then. I didn't invite her here. I don't know why she'd be in Riverton. But to Hendricks, the answer was obvious. This wasn't random. It was personal. By noon, she had Rowan's file on her desk. 47 years old. No major convictions, but a record of police calls to her residence during the years she'd been with Melissa. Disturbances, noise complaints, 1 reported domestic dispute. Nothing that had stuck. What caught Hendricks's attention was the timing of Rowan's last known address change. She'd moved out of her apartment in Montana just 2 months earlier. Her current residence was listed as temporary. That meant she could be anywhere. The investigative net widened. Hendricks assigned 2 officers to start calling Rowan's known associates. It didn't take long to find someone willing to talk, a woman named Natalie Burns, who had rented a room to Rowan for a few months before she left Montana. Over the phone, Burns was polite but cautious. I don't want trouble, she said. But yeah, Patty talked about Melissa a lot. Said she thought this new woman, Karen, had ruined her life. Did she ever say she'd hurt them? Hendricks asked. The pause. Not directly. But she said something once, that if she couldn't have Melissa, nobody would. I thought it was just talk. Guess it wasn't. By the end of that day, a second name surfaced, Stephen Blake. He was a longtime acquaintance of Rowan's, a wiry man in his early 30s who'd been seen with her in Montana and, more recently, in Oregon. No fixed address. Occasional labor jobs. A minor arrest for trespassing years back. Melissa's description of the second voice on the tape, the deeper one, matched what Hendricks found in Blake's file. She now had 2 likely suspects. That evening, she and Weller drove out to the Burtons' neighborhood again, this time to canvass for any overlooked witnesses. Most residents hadn't seen anything. But Mrs. Harwood, who lived 2 houses down, remembered something odd. I saw a man and a woman walking past just before sunset, she said. Didn't recognize them. The man was in tight jeans, had a cap pulled down. The woman, dark auburn hair, maybe late 40s, was wearing this yellow jacket, but it wasn't zipped, and it was chilly out. She kept one hand in her pocket like she was holding something. Hendricks's mind snapped to the case notes. Patricia Rowan, heavy-set, auburn hair, and a pastel yellow windbreaker listed among her belongings when she left Montana. It was enough for a bolo, be on the lookout, alert statewide. Photos of Rowan and Blake went out to patrol units and hospitals, in case one of them had the injuries suggested by the blood trail from the scene. 2 days later, a break came from an unexpected place. A rental car company in northern Oregon called in. One of their employees had seen the alert on the news and recognized Rowan's face. She rented from us on the 1st of the month, the man said. Returned the car late that night. I remember because she had a bandage on her hand. The mileage on the rental matched almost exactly the distance from Riverton to the Montana border and back. For Hendricks, it was confirmation. Rowan had come here deliberately. But the case wasn't ready to go to a judge. They needed something physical, DNA, the weapon, anything to place Rowan and Blake inside the Whitfield home during the murders. The answering machine tape was damning, but still circumstantial. That was when Hendricks decided to change tactics. She reached out to a contact in the Montana State Police, a detective who'd dealt with Rowan before. "She's not the type to confess," he said. "But Blake? If you press the right way, he'll crack. He's not built for the weight of something like this." It was a gamble. Hendricks had to get Blake in a room without tipping Rowan off. The break came faster than expected. Blake was picked up for a minor parole violation in a small Oregon town 3 hours away. When Riverton officers arrived to collect him, they didn't mention the murders. Not until he was sitting in the interview room, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him, did Hendricks slide a photograph across the table. Karen and Ethan, smiling, taken months before the attack. "Tell me this isn't what I think it is," she said quietly. Blake stared at the photo, his Adam's apple bobbing. Then Hendricks reached into a folder and played the recording. When Karen's voice pleaded, "Patty, stop," Blake's shoulders slumped. That was the first crack. And cracks, Hendricks knew, had a way of turning into collapses. Stephen Blake stared at the photograph on the table for a long time. He didn't touch it, but Hendricks could see his eyes moving over the details. The way Karen's arm wrapped around Ethan's shoulder, the broad grin on Ethan's face, the easy warmth between them. It was the kind of image that left no room for hate, only the evidence of a shared life. When Hendricks pressed play on the tape again, he flinched at the first crash of glass. And when Karen's voice cried out, "Patty, stop, please," his hands clenched into fists so tightly the knuckles whitened. He didn't look up when he spoke. "I didn't know she was gonna, not like that. I thought we were just going to talk. Scare her maybe. Make her see." Hendricks let the silence draw him out. "She called me that morning," Blake continued, his voice low. "Said she needed a ride to Riverton. She didn't have a license anymore, too many tickets, so she rented a car and had her daughter drive. Chloe dropped us off a few houses down from Karen's place." He paused, rubbing his hands over his face. "I figured we'd knock on the door, say our piece, leave. But Patty, she already had the gun." Hendricks felt the air in the room shift. "Where did she get it?" "Old thing," he said. "Looked like something from a pawn shop or somebody's attic. She told me not to worry about it. Said it was just in case." The rest came in broken pieces. How they'd approached the side of the house, how Patty pointed out a small dog door in the back. She told Blake to squeeze through and unlock the door from the inside. "I didn't want to," he admitted. "But she said if I didn't, she'd leave me there, and then she made this little joke about how it wouldn't matter if I ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. I didn't think she meant it, but I'd seen her lose it before." Once inside, they waited in the kitchen. The air smelled faintly of coffee from the morning. Blake remembered pacing near the counter, Patty standing near the door to the garage. It wasn't long before the sound of a car pulling in broke the silence. 2 sets of footsteps, heavier shoes on tile. The door opened and Ethan stepped in first, Karen behind him. They were mid-conversation. He couldn't even remember about what, when Patty raised the gun. "She shot him before he even saw her," Blake said, his voice cracking. "Ethan went down hard, and Karen, God, she didn't run. She went for her." What followed was a blur of motion and sound. Karen's voice sharp with fury, Patty shouting over her, the gun going off again. Blake remembered Karen lunging, grabbing for the weapon, and the 2 women slamming into the table. A lamp tipped and shattered. "She fought," Blake said, his hands trembling. "Even after Patty shot her, she fought. Kept telling her to stop. Kept begging her to let Ethan go." When the gun clicked empty, Patty's rage didn't cool, it deepened. She grabbed the first thing within reach, a kitchen knife from the counter. The struggle moved across the room, knocking over a chair, sending a ceramic vase crashing to the floor. Blake swore he saw Karen land a punch that made Patty stumble, but it only seemed to push her further. "And me?" Blake looked up at Hendricks finally. "I just stood there, like an idiot, watching." The moment he mentioned the phone, Hendricks leaned in. "You cut the cord?" He shook his head. "She did. I was near it, but she pushed me aside. Said no one was calling for help." When it was over, both victims lay still. Patty was breathing hard, her right hand bleeding from a cut, probably from the glass. She turned to him, eyes wild, and said, "Now you're part of it." They left the same way they came. Chloe was waiting in the car, the engine running. Blake said nothing to her, just climbed into the back seat. Patty cradled her injured hand, telling her daughter she'd tripped and cut it on the sidewalk. They drove out of Riverton, stopping at a small pond off the highway. Patty got out with the gun, disappeared down a slope, and came back empty-handed. Blake didn't ask where it went. In the days that followed, he kept expecting the police to knock on his door. When they didn't, he tried to tell himself it wasn't his problem, that he hadn't pulled the trigger. But the image of Karen still fighting, still pleading, stayed with him. Hendricks didn't interrupt his account. When he finished, she simply asked, "Will you help us find the gun?" Blake nodded slowly. "Yeah. I know where she threw it." That night, under cold halogen floodlights, a search team waded into the shallow pond Blake had described. The water was murky, littered with leaves and branches, but after 2 hours, one of the divers surfaced holding a small, mud-caked revolver. Forensics moved quickly. Ballistics matched the bullets recovered from both Karen and Ethan. The weapon, an antique .32 caliber, was registered to no one. But in the grime on its grip, analysts found something else. A partial fingerprint, later confirmed to belong to Patricia Rowan. With that, Hendricks had what she needed. An arrest warrant was signed before dawn. In Montana, Rowan's apartment was quiet when state police arrived. She answered the door in a faded robe, leaning heavily on the frame. Multiple sclerosis had slowed her movements, but her eyes were alert, wary. When she saw the Riverton detectives behind the troopers, she straightened. "You can't prove anything," she said before anyone spoke. Hendricks met her gaze. "We can. And we will." When Patricia, Patty Rowan, was brought back to Riverton, she didn't protest much, not in public, at least. She sat in the back of the cruiser with her hands cuffed in front of her, eyes fixed out the window as the Oregon countryside blurred past. If she was afraid, she didn't show it. At the station, she refused to speak without a lawyer. Every question from Detective Laura Hendricks was met with the same reply: no comment. That was fine. Hendricks had another angle. Her name was Chloe Rowan, Patty's 25-year-old daughter. The last link in the chain. Chloe had been the one who drove her mother and Stephen Blake to Riverton that day. In her first interview, she'd said she thought they were visiting an old friend of her mother's. She admitted she'd dropped them off and gone to run errands, only to return and find her mother with a bleeding hand. But she claimed she never asked questions. Hendricks knew that wasn't the whole truth. People didn't just ferry two adults across state lines without knowing why, especially when one came back injured. In the interview room, Chloe sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but she wasn't crying. She wore a plain teal hoodie and jeans, looking more like a college student on a bad day than the daughter of a murder suspect. "Chloe," Hendricks began, keeping her voice even, "I know this is hard, but your mother's choices don't have to be yours." Chloe's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Hendricks leaned forward, placing a clear evidence bag on the table. Inside was the revolver, still streaked with dried mud. "This is the gun that killed Karen Whitfield and Ethan Cole. Stephen Blake says he saw your mother throw it into the pond. We can put her at the scene. What I need to know is, were you there too?" The young woman's eyes flicked to the bag, then back to Hendricks. "I was in the car. That's all. But you heard them talking afterward, didn't you?" Chloe hesitated. "They said things." "What things?" Hendricks pressed. The silence stretched. Then Chloe exhaled sharply, as though something inside her had cracked. "They were arguing about how it got out of hand. My mom was mad that Stephen didn't help more. He said he never signed up for this. I didn't want to hear it, so I turned up the radio." "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Chloe's gaze dropped. "Because she's my mom. She's sick. She's all I have." It wasn't a confession of involvement, but it was enough to confirm what Hendricks already suspected. Chloe knew more than she wanted to admit. And in court, even small admissions could carry weight. Over the next week, the prosecution built their case. They had the weapon, the ballistics match, the partial fingerprint, Blake's testimony, and now corroboration from Chloe about post-crime conversations. What they didn't have was any sign of remorse from Patty Rowan herself. In her meetings with her lawyer, she remained adamant. They can't prove intent, she insisted. No one saw me pull the trigger. Blake's just trying to save himself. But the motive was clear enough to anyone who looked at the timeline. Years earlier, Melissa Hartman had ended her relationship with Rowan, moving on to start a new life with Karen. Rowan had tried to keep a connection, but when Melissa pulled away completely, jealousy took root. Friends from Montana recalled Rowan making bitter remarks about Karen, calling her a homewrecker and saying Melissa would come back if she didn't have that woman around. The trips from Montana to Oregon weren't casual visits. Witnesses confirmed that in the months before the murders, Rowan had been to Riverton multiple times, once parking outside Karen's house for over an hour without approaching. Natalie Burns, the former roommate, told investigators about a conversation in which Rowan described a plan to catch Karen alone and make her listen. At the time, Natalie had dismissed it as empty talk. Now it was chilling in its precision. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. The Whitfield and Cole families filled one side, their faces a mix of grief and determination. Melissa sat with them, her hand gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. Across the aisle, Rowan entered in a wheelchair, her illness now more visible. But her expression remained cold, unreadable. The prosecution laid out the evidence step by step, the tape recording capturing Karen's voice calling out, "Patty," the eyewitness descriptions matching Rowan's appearance, the rental car records, the recovered revolver, and Blake's detailed account. Blake himself testified, his voice shaking as he recounted the events. "She was going to do it with or without me. I should have stopped her." Then came Chloe. Her testimony was hesitant, but she confirmed driving her mother and Blake to Riverton and overhearing them afterward discussing how it happened. The defense tried to paint her as coerced by police, but her simple, steady tone carried weight. Finally, the tape was played for the jury. The room fell silent except for the chaotic sounds, shattering glass, raised voices, Karen's desperate pleas. When Melissa heard it, she closed her eyes, jaw trembling. The defense argued diminished capacity due to Rowan's illness, claiming she couldn't have physically overpowered two adults without Blake's active involvement. But the prosecution countered with the sheer ferocity of the attack and the evidence of premeditation. In the end, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Rowan was sentenced to life without parole. Blake, having cooperated, received 30 years for aiding and abetting. Chloe left the courthouse alone, walking past reporters without a word. Melissa never saw her again. For Detective Hendricks, the case was another reminder of a simple truth. In murder, the weapon is only part of the story. The real force is motive, and in Riverton, jealousy had been enough to destroy 3 lives and scar many more. The verdict settled over the courtroom like a final, heavy curtain. Reporters tapped furiously on their laptops, cameras clicked from the back row, and the jurors avoided looking at Patricia Rowan as they filed out. She didn't move when the judge read the sentence. Life without the possibility of parole. No chance at walking free again. Her lawyer leaned in, murmuring something that made her shake her head slowly, almost imperceptibly. Melissa Hartman sat still in the gallery. The moment the gavel fell, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It wasn't relief, exactly, more like the end of a long, suffocating chapter. Justice, people said, had been served. But justice didn't bring Karen back. Outside the courthouse, the November sky was flat and gray. A small crowd had gathered on the steps, curious locals, news crews, and a few who had known Karen and Ethan personally. Some were quiet. Others spoke in low tones about how things like this didn't happen in Riverton before. The town would hold on to that illusion, but everyone knew it was already broken. For Detective Laura Hendricks, the weeks after the trial were filled with paperwork, debriefings, and the slow unwinding of a case that had consumed months of her life. But some parts never closed neatly. Stephen Blake, now serving 30 years for aiding and abetting, wrote a letter to the Whitfield family through his attorney. In it, he said he was sorry for not stopping Rowan, sorry for letting fear dictate his actions. He didn't ask for forgiveness, and the family didn't offer it. Chloe Rowan moved away from Montana within a month of the sentencing. She didn't leave a forwarding address. Some speculated she wanted a clean break, to distance herself from her mother's legacy. Others thought she might still be carrying a loyalty she couldn't let go of. Hendricks doubted she'd ever come back to Riverton. Melissa faced her own quiet battles. She returned to the house only once after the crime, to pack up what was left. The kitchen tiles had been replaced, the walls repainted, but the space still felt wrong, like a room holding its breath. She couldn't stay there. Eventually, she moved into a smaller place across town, away from the familiar routes she'd once walked with Karen. She kept Baxter, the little Pomeranian, who grew gray around the muzzle in the years that followed. People often said dogs forgot trauma quickly, but Melissa noticed the way he stiffened around strangers. Friends encouraged her to start over somewhere new, but Melissa couldn't bring herself to leave Riverton entirely. It wasn't stubbornness, it was the belief that this was still her home, and leaving would be like letting Rowan take something else from her. In Riverton, the case left ripples that touched even those with no direct connection to it. The university where Karen and Ethan had worked installed new security protocols, cameras on maintenance entrances, ID checks after hours. Some called it overkill, others felt safer knowing it was harder for strangers to slip in unnoticed. The street where the Whitfield house once stood became quieter. The home itself changed hands twice, both new owners eventually moving out within a year. Rumors spread that it was unlucky, though no one spoke openly about why. Hendricks visited the families of Karen and Ethan one final time before closing her file. Karen's teenage son, Matthew, didn't talk much, but he listened as Hendricks explained the outcome in plain terms. His mother's killer would never be free. Ethan's parents expressed gratitude, though Hendricks could see the fatigue behind their eyes, the kind that comes from months of grief compressed into a trial's rigid schedule. Rowan's time in prison was unremarkable. She kept mostly to herself, her illness progressing until she relied on a wheelchair full-time. Staff described her as polite but guarded. She never admitted guilt, not to other inmates, not to the prison chaplain, and not to the parole board when, by procedural requirement, her sentence was reviewed. The decision was always the same: life without parole. In 2022, word reached Riverton that Rowan had died in her cell at the age of 71. No family claimed her remains. The news barely made a ripple in the local paper, a small notice under the obituaries. Stephen Blake would never walk free either. He died in 2020, still incarcerated of natural causes. Years later, when people in Riverton spoke of the murders, they talked about the recording, the 7 minutes of chaos that had been captured by the answering machine. They talked about how a name, buried in static and fear, had been the first thread to pull the truth into the light. Detective Hendricks moved on to other cases, but every so often, she thought of Karen's last moments, not as evidence, not as a point in closing arguments, but as a human fight for life. She thought of Ethan, stepping through that door, unaware that he was walking into someone else's vendetta. She never forgot the way Melissa had sat in the courtroom, jaw tight, hands gripping the armrest, listening to the voice of the woman who tried to erase her happiness. Justice, in the end, was a strange thing. It couldn't fix the hole left behind. But it could, for a moment, draw a line under what happened, giving the living permission to breathe again. And in Riverton, Oregon, that was enough. In the years that followed, Riverton healed in its own quiet way. New families moved in, children played in the park again, and the streets felt safe, or at least, safer than they had during that long winter when fear had settled like frost over every doorstep. But for those who had lived through the murders of Karen Whitfield and Ethan Cole, the town never quite returned to what it had been. It wasn't just the loss of 2 lives, it was the way it had happened, how something so violent had erupted inside a place built on trust and familiarity. Detective Laura Hendricks would sometimes walk that neighborhood, not on duty, just passing through. The Whitfield house had new owners again. They'd painted the siding a fresh pale blue and planted flower beds along the walkway. On warm evenings, the windows glowed and voices drifted out. Laughter, clinking dishes, the sounds of a life rebuilt over someone else's absence. Hendricks never introduced herself. She just kept walking, letting the moment be. Melissa Hartman stayed in Riverton, despite the memories. She found work at a local community center, teaching workshops and organizing events. People admired her resilience, but she never liked the word. Resilience, to her, implied choice, and she hadn't chosen to endure what happened. She'd simply learned how to keep moving forward. Sometimes she'd see Hendricks in town, and they'd share a nod. Not friends, exactly, but bound by something neither could explain to outsiders. The kind of connection forged in the worst of circumstances. The case became a cautionary tale in law enforcement circles. Hendricks was asked more than once to speak at training seminars about it, not because of the forensic work or the arrest record, but because of the answering machine. 7 minutes of chaos that had, unintentionally, preserved the truth. It's a reminder, she would tell the room, that evidence doesn't always come from where you expect it, and that the smallest detail, a name buried in the noise, can be the key to unlocking everything. She never added what she thought privately, that sometimes the most valuable evidence is also the hardest to listen to. Rowan's death in prison closed the legal chapter, but not the emotional one. For Ethan's parents, the loss never dulled. For Karen's son, Matthew, the crime had taken more than a mother. It had stolen the feeling of safety that most teenagers take for granted. In one of their last conversations, Hendricks told him, "Your mom fought for you until the very end." She didn't embellish, didn't soften it. She wanted him to know that Karen had faced what was coming head-on, that she had used her last moments to try to protect someone else. The lesson the town drew from it was less about murder and more about the quiet ways jealousy can grow when left unchecked. People started noticing the signs more, in friends, in neighbors, even in themselves. The grudges that seemed harmless. The offhand remarks that carried a little too much weight. It wasn't about living in fear. It was about recognizing the currents beneath the surface, the ones that could pull someone under before anyone realized what was happening. One rainy evening years later, Melissa sat on her porch with Baxter curled in her lap, watching the streetlights flicker on. The air smelled of wet asphalt and pine, and somewhere a radio played faintly through an open window. She thought about Karen, not the way she'd last seen her, but the way she'd been in the good days, bent over a woodworking project, hair tucked behind her ears, a smudge of sawdust on her cheek, humming to herself. People often asked Melissa why she never left Riverton. She never gave the full answer, but it was this: leaving would feel like erasing Karen from the place she'd worked so hard to call home. Staying kept her memory alive, not in the shadow of the crime, but in the sunlight of ordinary moments. In the end, the story of the Riverton murders wasn't just about what happened inside a kitchen one gray November afternoon. It was about what people do with the pieces afterward, how they carry them, how they choose to remember, and how they decide, in their own way, to keep living. Justice had been served, yes. But the true resolution lived in the choices made long after the trial ended, to walk the same streets without flinching, to fill the same rooms with laughter again, and to believe, against all odds, that trust could return. For Detective Hendricks, Melissa Hartman, and the quiet town of Riverton, that was the legacy Karen and Ethan left behind. Not the violence, not the fear, but the proof that even in the wake of loss, life could go on.